Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. We go to the phones. Joining us this morning, GOP political strategist Matt Mackowiak. Matt, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Chad. I'm doing great. How about you?
Doing great. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. Before we get into some statewide politics, because there's some movement, obviously, statewide with the election and then with the speaker's non-race race that we're seeing develop, let's talk about what happened nationally. And we're still not done. Thanks to Florida and Arizona, we're still counting some votes. But what we do know is that the House, Nancy Pelosi's probably going to lead the House. She's going to be House Speaker unless the Democrats can find somebody else. We're going to have a Republican-controlled Senate. Obviously, the White House, President Trump, and the Republicans. We have split government here. How are the two sides going to get along?
Yeah, it's a big question. Obviously, the next 2 years are going to be very different than the last 2 years, and that's going to have sweeping ramifications for the country, but in particular for the White House. I think they may have taken for granted the benefit of having a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. Over the last 100 years, I think it's something like 10 years total. The Republicans have had the White House, the House, and the Senate. So divided government is what we're looking at. Obviously, Republicans and Democrats have pretty different ideas about what they want to do from a policy perspective. But I think if you look for opportunities where they can work together, if they choose to, there are two that come to mind. The first I would just put on the table is drug prices. The president's talked a lot about that. Perhaps reimportation might be on the table. I think both sides want to do something about that. The bigger ticket item is infrastructure. The White House really wanted to approach the issue of infrastructure in the first term. They got sort of sidetracked with health care initially, and then the tax reform bill took a little too much time. And so they never really did get to a point where they could put out their infrastructure plan and get support behind it and make a legislative push. It may be that the best way to do infrastructure is to do it on a bipartisan basis. There are going to be differences in how the two parties approach that issue and how you fund it, how much public money is spent versus not, whether the gas tax is raised, which House Republicans oppose. But if you just look at it from a water standpoint, if you look at it from a highway standpoint, there are pretty significant needs across the country for infrastructure, and that's not even really to take steps forward. It's really just to maintain what we have, make sure we have clean drinking water, and that our highways are adequate for our needs. So there is an opportunity for both sides to come together. It's a big-ticket item, would help the economy, and it would be something both sides could point to, and that would be good for the future of the country. So I think that is one issue where you will see some bipartisan work and hopefully some bipartisan progress.
And I remember from the campaign, just when it was between President, then candidate Trump and Hillary Clinton. This is something they not necessarily agreed on, but something that they both talked about. The money figures were different, and if I'm correct, I believe Trump's was actually higher. He wanted to spend more money on infrastructure, and there was a divide even among Republicans on that. So, is that something that they have to overcome, is deciding first the Republicans have to come together, then the Democrats, and then both sides come together?
Yeah, and of course, as you look at the makeup, right, you're going to have, a majority of Democrats will have the House, but they won't have a huge majority. But obviously, anything that passes on a party line vote in the House is going to have a tough time getting 60 votes in the Senate. And so you're going to maybe have situations where, in fact, you're going to have situations for sure where the House passes liberal legislation on a range of issues that probably is dead on arrival in the Senate. The question is, what issues are not dead on arrival? And infrastructure should be one of them, which is not dead on arrival. And so, again, I think if the House Democrats take a bipartisan approach to that issue in the new Congress, it would give it real momentum in the Senate so that the Senate can also look at it in a bipartisan way. Infrastructure is an issue where we should get, 375 votes in the House or 350 votes in the House and 70 or 80 votes in the Senate. If they approach it that way, nobody getting 100% of what they want, but nobody getting 0% of what they want, I think there's real potential there. But you're right. There are going to be spending concerns on the Republican side. House Freedom Caucus members are not going to want massive investment, sort of a stimulus type of approach, from on behalf of the taxpayer. But obviously the Republican approach was to sort of take public money and try to leverage private money. Maybe make it like a 1-to-10 ratio, public to private. Democrats are going to want to probably flip that, and so maybe the final solution is somewhere in the middle, where they can hopefully get something done that really would make a difference in many of these communities where we're having explosive growth or where you're having infrastructure that's just not being maintained at the level it needs to be.
Now, timing's going to matter on this, right? Because once 2020 hits or late 2019 hits, isn't it done? I mean, you've got both sides running for president at that point. So, I mean, you've got a few months to get an infrastructure package together.
It's a good point, and I think over the weekend you saw White House officials, and even Democratic incoming committee chairs, argue about what the priorities are going to be. And if Democrats really want to try to, go after this president personally, which their initial indications are they want to, that they want to investigate him, his family, his staff, his cabinet, using subpoena power, launching 15 or 20 different investigations. It's hard to sort of be the subject of aggressive investigations like that on 1 hour of one day, and then turn around and be asked to work together on an important issue like infrastructure. So I think they're going to have to figure out what their priority is. Do they want to advance the agenda of the country, make the country better, or do they just want to sort of punish Donald Trump personally? But you're right. I mean, they have 1 year to do something over this 2-year Congress. 2020 is going to be entirely about the presidential campaign. You're going to have 15 or 20 or 25 Democrats running. You're going to have debates and early state contests. And, of course, the president will be engaged in his reelection at that point as well. So it's 1 year. How much can they get done in that 1 year? It's going to be up to the leaders to decide that, to make the tough choices, and to rally their members behind whatever their vision is.
Let's take a look at state politics. This was, not, in my opinion, not a great midterm for the Republicans.
No.
Statewide, Republicans did win, but not by huge margins.
Yeah.
What was your takeaway from this election?
Yeah, there's a lot to be concerned about. There's no question about that, and anyone that denies that, I think, is denying reality. It looks like, 12 seats the Democrats picked up in the Texas House. I forget if that actually has grown 1 or 2 since election night. It's at least 12. Certainly 2 state Senate seats, which are valuable, which takes the Republican conference down to 19, which is just over the 3/5 threshold out of the 31 senators. 2 congressional seats. Those were Hillary districts by 1% and 1%, respectively, but Sessions and Culberson really could have won. The problem is Beto swamped Dallas County and Harris County, and it gave neither of those candidates really a chance. If you look at where Beto overperformed, it was particular geographic areas in the state. It was Dallas County, it was Harris County, it was Central Texas, and it was El Paso. But the real thing that was most concerning, I think, for Republicans, or should be, was the suburbs. He flipped Tarrant County, which is honestly pretty unthinkable to me. Flipped Fort Bend, just outside of Harris County. And so you had some down ballot losses there in the state house in some of those areas. The judicial losses were staggering and are going to have sweeping ramifications for the future of the state of Texas over the next 4 years. Every Republican judge in Harris County lost, every single one of them. They have some ridiculous number, like 50 or 60 on the ballot, if I remember correctly. You had, I think, three Court of Appeals that went majority Republican, majority Democrat overnight. Yeah, look, I mean, we got to wake up. I do think part of it was the Beto effect. He had $80 million to spend. He ran an aggressive, energetic campaign. He got enormous national media attention. He fired up white liberals, and that benefited the Democratic ticket. It made Beto narrow the margin statewide. He still lost, but he lost by 2.9%, and that is a number that makes you think, wow, maybe Texas is competitive. Now, if you look everywhere else, it wasn't quite as competitive with Abbott winning by a good margin, but then some of the other statewide in that 4 or 5 point range. So it may have been an unusual set of circumstances that resulted in these kind of results. It may also be that this is the beginning of the state becoming a two-party state again. We just don't know yet, and it's going to be a question of how 2020 looks. But in the meantime, I think Republican legislators and statewide officials need to look very soberly at these election results and perhaps adapt their approach in a way that gets them back to being a majority, the Republican Party being a majority party in Texas and having majority support among the citizens.
What do you take away from the Dan Patrick race? That was closer than I think most people expected it to be.
It was. There's no question about that. I imagined Patrick's margin was going to be closer to Abbott's than it was to Cruz's, and it was actually closer to Cruz's than it was to Abbott's. Quite a bit closer. If I remember, I think Patrick won by 5. And Patrick spent decent money, and Collier didn't really do much. He confused motion with action. He didn't really run a statewide campaign. He didn't have the resources to do it. I think you might have had a small number of Republicans, perhaps liberal or moderate Republicans, who voted against Patrick to try and send a signal. That may have been the Beto effect as well, but of course that raises the question, well then why did Abbott win by such a large margin? Yeah. For whatever reason, you had these people in the middle that I think were Beto, Abbott, Collier voters, right? It's hard for me to know why someone would approach it that way, but I think some number did. Tens or if not hundreds of thousands of Texans approached their ballot that way. So look, I think there are some hard questions a lot of our officials on the Republican side need to ask themselves, and this is going to be an important session, much more important now than we thought it was going to be, in addressing school finance, addressing property tax reform, a range of issues, keeping the economy strong, addressing state spending, and of course all that is going to be very much determined by the speaker's race, which has taken an interesting turn last week. Yeah,
it appears as though we're narrowing it down big time, and it looks like Chairman Dennis Bonnen, is on his way to being the next Speaker of the Texas House. You had Price yesterday. Phil King announced that he was dropping out, and then today Tan Parker announced that he was dropping out as well.
Yeah, there's been real coalescing just in the last, 3 or 4 days. I think Price dropping out and getting behind Bonnen rather than Drew Darby out at West Texas was a signal, an important signal and a shift. I don't think the Speaker's race is over, but I think it's getting closer to being over, and it seems right now that it's coming down to Bonnen and Drew Darby. And so that to me is interesting. I don't think Bonnen is at the 76 votes he needs yet. I suspect he's somewhere between 50 and 60 perhaps. But you are seeing folks drop out, and Phil King was sort of in some ways the conservative choice for Speaker, and the fact that he's now gotten behind Bonnen, I think, is a leading indicator as well. So Bonnen has real momentum right now. There's no question about that. This is all leading towards the caucus vote on December 1st, which is will be interesting to see whether that holds all the way to the Speaker vote in early January. There'll be 5 weeks there where there'll be an opportunity for Democrats to try to pull 9 Republicans over and elect their own Speaker together. And I don't think that's going to happen. I certainly hope it's not going to happen. I think we'd have a terrible session if that ultimately happens. But I do think there's that there's a coalescing behind Bonnen right now that is real and that is gaining momentum, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 2 or 3 days. Absolutely,
Matt. As always, appreciate your time. Tell folks about your latest podcast and also your newsletter.
Absolutely. The newsletter is called Must Read Texas. It's intended to take all the news from around the state and put it in one easy-to-read format, and we email it out to over 3,000 Texans each weekday. You can sign up for a free 1-week trial at mustreadtexas.com. The podcast is called Mac on Politics. It is in the iTunes Store, on Google Play, on Stitcher, and at maconpoliticspodcast.com. Most recent guest is Ron Brownstein, the really quite brilliant political analyst, independent political analyst who writes for The Atlantic and is a political analyst, senior political analyst at CNN. We talk about 2018 and 2020, what the midterm tells us, both from just this past Tuesday, but also for 2020. And he tells me which 2 states he thinks will determine the presidency in 2020, and they are not 2 that I think most people would guess. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope people check it out.
Yeah, very interesting. Matt, as always, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Take care.
Have a good one. It's Matt Mackowiak, Chad Hasty Show News Talk, KFYO.